Hello, and welcome to episode 16 of That 60s Recording podcast, the podcast that has conversations inspired by the golden era of recording. My name is Joe Montague, and I am your host. I hope you've all had a great couple of weeks. We're still in a we're calling it lockdown number 2 here in the UK, but it doesn't feel anywhere near as severe as the last lockdown. But yes, everybody's sort of trying to decide what's going to happen for Christmas, and there's some rumours that we might be able to do whatever we want for 5 days whatever we want within reason. So sort of look forward to that. So my guest today is Jerry Hammack, who is the author of the Beatles Recording Reference Manuals. I would assume that most people are aware of these books. It's a 5-part series where Jerry notes down the technical details of things that happened in the Beatles recording sessions. Things like tape bounce downs and loads of little technical details which are not available elsewhere. And we sort of discuss how he decided what information he was going to include throughout the podcast. He's just released episode 5. It's not a podcast. Book number 5. Which goes through Let It Be to Abbey Road, and it's the final book in the series, so he's completed his mission, which has been a long time in the making. It's a really interesting conversation. I've tried to cover a bit of sort of Beatles details, which obviously we're all interested in, but I'm particularly interested in how on earth he went about finding this stuff out, and what did he find out when he was doing it. We all have accepted truths about the Beatles, and he had to look past all of that and just go for the facts that he could find out. So I was really interested to see how he tackled all of those things and what he learnt during the process. As has become the recent custom, this is a 2-part series, which I'm really enjoying because it means I can have much lengthier conversations with the guests, and I don't feel pressure to move topics quicker. I can relax and have a bit more of a conversation. Okay, so without any further ado, here he is, Jerry Hammack. Okay, so I'm really pleased to be joined by Jerry Hammack, who is the author of the... I have to check the book's title now, the specific name of the book's titles. How embarrassing, I've only just got started. So the Beatles Recording Reference Manuals, which is a 5-part book series on the specific background details of the Beatles recording sessions, and you're about to embark on your final book release, book number 5. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. For the holiday season coming up here, I'll have volume 5 ready to go, and I'm excited to have it out there. It'll the last of these, and the end of a 13-year odyssey. So yeah, I'm excited to have it out there and have it in people's hands. And I know people are excited to learn about Let It Be in Abbey Road. So happy to share that with them.
Do you think that excitement has built more towards the end of the books? I would guess that people are particularly interested in the later side of recording, but I might stand corrected.
Well, it's interesting. I believe, I'd have to literally check the numbers, but I believe my best-selling volume has been volume 1, which covered 61 through 64, covered My Bonnie through Beatles for Sale. And maybe it's because there's so much, content there, like 4 albums worth of content there, that people were interested. The recordings themselves were just so straightforward. But certainly for people that are really into the recording history, there's a lot more interesting, a lot more meat on the bone when you get into the Pepper era and out through White Album and then Abbey Road. Let It Be was a bit of a backtrack, but actually not much.
Could you? This might feel a bit of an exam question, but could you explain or just tell us how the volumes are broken up? So volume 1 through to 5.
Yeah, volume 1 covers 1961 through 64. So that is the My Bonnie recordings with Tony Sheridan out through Beatles for Sale. Volume 2 covered 65 and 66, so that picked up with Help and goes through Revolver. Volume 3 was Pepper and Magical Mystery Tour, so 67 in its entirety. Volume 4 was 1968 through early 69, so that covered the White Album recordings and then the release of the Yellow Submarine soundtrack. The majority of the work, aside from Martin's soundtrack work on it, was done prior to 69, but the release was in early 69. Actually about 6 months late compared to the movie. So, and now the final one will pick up 1969-70. We'll pick up with Abbey Road and See You All the Way Through, Let It Be.
Fantastic. As we had a little chat just before we started recording, and I was considering ways, directions of taking this conversation. And one of the things I'd like to do, I do have some specific questions that I'd like to ask you. And I thought a good place to start might be just to, I'm really interested in how you went about doing this whole project. It feels like such a mammoth task. By some of the interviews I watched that you'd done already, they've mentioned that you'd started it 8 years ago, but it sounds like obviously that's been a while since then. So what has it been, 12, 13 since the germination of this idea?
Yeah, if I'm recalling correctly, I got started on it about 2008.
Wow.
So yeah, 12 years or so. And where the true germination of this happened in recording sessions where I would be producing. And this is back in Seattle where I used to live, and I live in Toronto, Canada. And I would inevitably in a session, you would hear, the Beatles would be referenced. It's time to do the bass. This is the one that always comes up. It's time to do the bass. Hey man, can you get me that McCartney bass sound? What McCartney bass sound? Oh, the Pepper bass sound. It's so cool. It's just thick and cool. How do they do that? I want that. And one way or another, these references would come up. Can I get this? Can I get that related to the Beatles? And on a instance by instance basis, then as a producer, you always say yes, sure, McCartney bass sound, no problem, you got it. And then I go track down as best I could what was that, and okay, Fender Bassman amplifier, AKG's C12 large diaphragm condenser, backed up with a STC 4038, sometimes with DI. Okay, I can put that together, and I get them the bass sound, and then they're and ultimately, of course, you know this from doing recording. Those components are good to know. What but of course, I'm not going out and finding an $18,000 AKG C12
No.
to do this. I'm just getting a large diaphragm microphone. I'm rolling off some of the low end on it, but you understand the kind of the combinations that come together to do that. So once you understand those things, then you can give people what they want. That's where it started. And I had some time on my hands at one point, 12 years ago.
Yeah.
And I thought, it'd be kind of fun just to look into some more of this stuff, learn some more about this. And as I started down that road, I was like, I wonder, and I discovered there was nothing out there that did this. There was nothing out there that, while there was discrete resources that told parts of the Beatles' story in the studio, everything from Lewison's recording sessions, Babbitt's Beatles gear book, Ryan and Kehue's recording the Beatles. These had pieces of it, different pieces of it, but no one had put together the story of first take to remix. How do these songs start? How do they move? How do they work together? Or how did the recording come together to end up with the track that I hear? And I was like, that's a huge gap in the Beatles' history. And I thought, I can fill that gap. I know enough that I can fill that gap and do that research. I'm interested enough to do that research. The research alone was 8 years.
Wow.
8 or 9 years of research before any book was released.
That's unbelievable. I mean, it's a can of worms once you start opening it up, I suppose.
It really is, and to do this accurately, everything has to line up. So it isn't just that they were at EMI Studios, Abbey Road nowadays. It isn't just that they're at EMI or Trident or Olympic or Regent. It isn't just that. It's that, in the case of EMI, that they were at EMI in 64 in Studio 3 with Norman Smith as the engineer and, let's say, Emmerich as the tape op. It's because and Martin as a producer. From all of that, and why that is, and again, anyone who's familiar with recording will understand. Engineers have their preferences. They record things in certain ways that make sense to them, ways that they can just nail anytime that they have to. So the preferences of the engineers, the equipment that was in that particular studio, in that facility, all of that has to line up before you can start to really tell the full story of what went on. So I had to, on a year by year basis, understand what was available in the studio, who was running that gear, what were their preferences, how did they like to record, and then what musicians were there, what instruments did they have, and all of those things had to line up to tell just the technical backstory, then telling the story of, but what actually got recorded. It was an overdub of this or that. That came together through both an analysis of, I've got over 5,000 tracks of Beatles audio that kind of gone and have gone through forensically to understand these things, and some of it we know that this was for instance, this was remix mono 3 of Strawberry Fields Forever, and I know that this was done on X date from John Barrett's tape logs and Lewison's work and John C. Wynn's work. We know that this was done on X date. So now you can either move forward or backwards in time from those things and either additively or subtractively understand what the state of the recording was before that mix was made.
Yeah.
Or after that mix was made. And that helps you understand that if the state changes between here and here, what changed in it, that was the work that was done. And it's a detective story. It's the ability to untie knots.
In a sense, you're kind of uniquely qualified to do this your experience as an engineer. Presumably, you were a huge Beatles fan before this to sort of even consider undertaking this task.
Yeah.
And you must have an extremely large amount of patience. So all of those qualities allow you to do that detective work and be so, what's the word I'm looking for? Like pernickety about getting those details.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, that really, I really do think that is the combination of skills that was required for this. And I had the time and the wherewithal to get it done as well. Another part of my personality is I just cannot not finish something. I can't half do a job. I have to really do the job. And when you're doing nonfiction, one of the goals always of doing nonfiction work or historical work is you want that book that you're writing to be the last word. You want it to pass muster with people that know this stuff. And you want it to, in my case, and with the people that I admire in the Beatles author community, the idea is you've got to add something new and you've got to add value, and also it has to be able to pass the fact check phase, right?
Yes. Yeah.
So mercifully, when I've been talking to people that were doing, that had done the work, and talking to the likes of like Ken Scott, and talking to Richard Langham and Ken Townsend and these guys, no one's going, oh, what are you talking about? How'd you come up with that one? So mercifully, things are, it's passing that check. But I wanted this to be the last word. I didn't want anyone to ever have to write this book again. And so that's why it took so long in the research, to make sure everything lined up. And then I needed to be able to tell the story in a way that was accessible. And so, hopefully I've achieved that, and it's benefiting not only, deep audio geek Beatle people, but people that just want to throw in their headphones and hear something new.
On that note, it certainly does. I mean, you've put background into every set of details that you've put into the book. There is background research that you've written out as prose, which makes it gives it a context which is really refreshing. As you said before, it's not just dry information that you've inputted. It's obviously it's called a reference manual, which makes it very easy. So you can dip in and out of it on a per song basis. Yep. However, it's nice to get a bit of context in what you're listening to. I'm interested in how it felt. The Beatles is a very contested area, and you were embarking on this sort of the be-all and end-all of, well, not be-all and end-all, because presumably you'll revise things and new things will come to light potentially. But in as best you can, a definitive guide to these things. What was your sort of mindset and feeling towards getting involved in this? Even now, the stuff that you've written and the people you've spoken to surely show it as being a definitive, but then you still get Beatles sort of nerds on forums and things all contesting different ideas, and people who supposedly sort of are well researched. I'm sort of choosing my words carefully. We call it the Beatles police in the band I work with. But it's a pretty dangerous place to start looking into. I think.
Well, I frankly I've never concerned myself with the Beatles police. I'm not trying to please them. I'm not trying to. If I was trying to please them, I would have been taking into account a lot of information that just doesn't pass the test academically.
Yeah, hearsay.
It's hearsay. It's accepted truth. I don't pay much attention to those things. I heard from someone that it just isn't rigorous. I heard that he did it this way. Well, yeah, but if you look at the tape, you'll find out that, or you listen to the tape, listen to the breakdown, you'll understand that it couldn't have happened that way. So I feel the way that I avoided that was to be as rigorous as I possibly could. Was to always check myself, and I'm always open to correction. I mean, in each of the books it says, if if there's something in here that you think is just boneheaded, get in touch with me and let me know, what you found. And I've made a number of minor errors throughout the books that have been corrected. On the website, if any of your listeners have early versions of the books, on the website there is a downloadable document that has where I've made corrections in any of the volumes that they can download and they can insert in their volume, so they need to buy the book again. But nothing, there's nothing glaring. There was a number of like copy paste things, or where what's one. The tremolo on Lennon's first 325 wasn't a Bigsby. It was the factory, the factory one that came with Rickenbacker. I had that wrong for the Sheridan sessions. a guy in Germany, who knew about these things contacted me and, corrected those kinds of things. I mean, yeah, I never, I know it's contentious, but I never treat it that way. And I don't treat people that confront me about the facts, as my enemy, because we're all trying to go for the truth. We're all trying to go for the most accurate information. And that's been my goal all along. So that I'm not perfect. I don't get everything right. I don't get everything right the first time. But together with some people that have been that have been in touch and helped me understand some things that I've either missed or haven't been quite as accurate as I could be. I've dialed them in. I've got them as accurate as I can get them.
Well, you've made yourself a very approachable person, which is nice. It's almost you've created a community which is focused on finding the truth for this, and through your rigorous research, you can choose whether to accept or dispel certain things that people might put to you. Did you have to change your so accepted truths is one of the phrases you said a minute ago. Did you have to sort of get rid of those accepted truths that you had beforehand? And did it challenge you in any way?
Yeah, in a number of cases, it has. One of the biggest takeaways for me that I didn't fully appreciate was how much the band recorded together live. Like how many of the backing tracks through the entire catalog were done as a group, together in the studio, performing together. That was one. The other was the work ethic that the Beatles had when it came to recording and making the music. We're only exposed to this late in their career. We're only really exposed to this when we get to Let It Be, and we have the Niagara reels from the Twickenham rehearsal sessions. Those rehearsal sessions were not the exception to the rule. They were the rule. So here you see the Beatles getting ready to work on an album, and they're spending 6 or 8 hours together on a daily basis, and they're playing through some of these tracks, like in the Twickenham instance, they're playing through, let's say, Two of Us, and they're doing it 38 times, 45 times.
Unbelievable.
And that's why when you hear the song, it sounds like it just flows out of them. And they were doing that all along. It's just we don't have, no one records rehearsals. If they, in the few instances that they did record their rehearsal takes of things, they would record over them with the proper takes. And we only have evidence of those because they were what was left on the tape when they had a keeper, when they had a good backing track. But those two things were very eye-opening for me. I grew up in the 60s. I started recording in the 70s. So into full, 16, 24 track multi-track. In the 70s, everything was, a lot of the recording was done as built up songs take by take by take by take or piece by piece. Not a lot of, or the focus wasn't as much on a big group performance in a number of situations. And the perception was of not of a group performance. But so I had that bias in my head that all this stuff was built piece by piece, especially the later stuff. And you find, when you find out that both because of the limitations of 4 and 8 track and just the way that these guys worked, that they were doing a lot of this stuff together. When they were doing overdubs or superimpositions, they were called in the era, they would do them together. They would do all the percussion. So, tambourine and maracas and hand claps, and they're all done together. Put down the tambourine, clap your hands for a couple takes, pick up the tambourine again. Record the organ part along with the guitar solo. These were all, they were done together. They were performing these things like a group performs, not like solo people, or like solo artists. And that was, again, that went through the whole of their career. That was just the way that these guys worked, and that was surprising to me because I think the popular history of the Beatles makes kind of gets your mind in a place where you want to compartmentalize these different eras. That, oh, this is when they were a band in the Beatlemania era, and this is when they were studio guys in the Pepper era, and this is when they were solo guys starting in the White Album era, right? And that's all nonsense. It's all nonsense.
It's fascinating. There's so much to unpick, even just from what you've said. I mean, on the percussion, which obviously is something I'm really interested in. As you, I think you might have seen, I'm recreating recordings of some of Ringo's playing, which is something I
your drum sounds dynamite too.
Really, thanks so much.
Really good.
Oh, that I appreciate that coming from you. When I go to do the percussion overdubs or superimpositions, which is a word that I have never actually said out loud before, I don't think, just in my head. I always notice it's John playing the tambourine, and I mean, it just seems to be overwhelmingly, maybe it's just the songs I've picked that it's John, but it means that the tambourine part throughout the song tends to start off fairly sort of structured, and then as the song goes on, it tends to get a bit wayward because I gather his attention span's probably not the best.
No, not the best at all.
But as a drummer, it would usually be, if I was doing an attended session in a studio, as opposed to sort of remote what I do, it would rest on my shoulders to do the percussion overdubs, and it often isn't that way with the Beatles. Well, it almost is never that way. It's always John, Paul, or George doing the percussion overdubs and Ringo doing the kit part, which is a really interesting thing.
Yeah, in a lot of cases that's what was going on. Certainly, it was typically all hands on deck. If they were available to do something, they would just get it done. And so if with the example we've been talking about, if in their heads the percussion additions to the drum kit, the drum part on the basic track is, I want bongos, I want a tambourine, I want some maracas. They're not going to wait for Ringo to play all of those things. They didn't have the real estate for it either. They didn't have the tracks for it. So yeah, whoever can play it plays it, and that was just the way they worked. They one of the I think a misconception from people that don't record, and I don't mean this. I'm not trying to say it to be grandiose or superior in saying this. A misperception is that we're gonna make this the coolest thing that we can make it, and whatever it takes to do it, that's what we're gonna do. Typically, that's not the case. Typically, the case is I need to get the work done. I need to get a drum part done. I need to get the bass part done. I need to get this done. And you do what it takes to get the work done, and then you move on to the next work. The Beatles are very much of that school because they were under such horrendous time restraints. There was always a single to deliver or always an album to deliver. And in their early years, that was teamed with, there's also concerts to do. There's television to do. There's radio to do. There's movies to do. So, you don't languish over things in those situations. You get the work done. And, was Lennon the best percussion player? Probably not. But he was available. And
it adds character to the song. I love the raggedy percussion sounds that you hear on the records. They're often, when I'm picking them apart, they're often so off time. And I'm quite conscious about that when I record my sort of impressions of it. Do I play how I hear it, or do I play it accurately? And I try to do the accurate version as best I can because if I'm honest, I'm a trained musician, so it's very difficult for me to play in that way. But there's certain there's a certain sentimentality, if you like, of the way that somebody plays a percussion instrument who isn't a percussionist, and I think that adds real character to a lot of the particularly later Beatles stuff that isn't just a shaking a tambourine throughout the whole song.
Yeah, the emotion in music is not found in perfection. The emotion in music is found in the human elements. Excuse me. And those human elements are, often that it's just not quite spot on. It's just not quite. It's not quite there. As a producer, Martin understanding that this was good enough. This did the job that needed to be done. We can move on now. It's a critical aspect of being a producer, and Martin had it down. There's an example I always bring up of the guitar and bass parts for "Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds." So at the chorus, there's a simultaneous part that is dum dum bum 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 bum, that's being played by Harrison on a Leslie guitar and McCartney on bass. Harrison's guitar work is so ragged and so ugly. It doesn't sound good. It's not. He doesn't hit all the notes. For whatever possible chemical reason there might have been behind that. But in context with the track, it's exactly right. It's just what the track needed. And Martin understood that. He doesn't have to hit it all. I just have to feel that's the right thing. And when it feels right, again, in the studio, when it feels right, it's next.
Yes. I think often, from my experience, that can be misconstrued as being lazy, but in fact, it's being efficient, as to sort of paraphrase what you're saying. And I think that a lot of artists, when they're creating their art, want perfection. And actually, like you've said, it's not perfection that gives you the character, and it takes somebody to sort of challenge that in order to finish a project off, in a sense. And I think that's quite a. You sort of said what you've said in the context of people who don't record often, and I think it even happens with people who do record often, that's what a producer's role is, in a sense.
Yeah, I was producing a session with a vocalist, and the song was just this really raw track, and he comes in and does a pass on the vocal, and it was one of his first passes on the vocal, and I'm listening to it, and I'm like, that's it, man. That's the that's the feel. You're not, and so he's done with it, and he's like, okay, let's do that again. And I'm like, no, let's not do that again. He's like, what do you mean? He goes, my intonation was off on this, and da 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 da. And I said, yeah, but listen to it again, and listen to what you're saying too, and with what you're saying in the lyric and how you sung that. That's the take. And 3 months later, album's out, and I get a call from the guy, and he's like, "Thank you so much for not letting me sing that again, because that was the take." And no, it wasn't perfect in any way. It wasn't perfect, but that's what was cool about it. That's what worked about it. So I'm always listening for those in between spaces. I'm always listening for a great lesson I learned from this blues guitarist, a friend of mine out of Chicago. He always told me, he said, because I play multi instruments and stuff. My favorite instruments is probably the bass or piano is probably my two favorites. But as a bass player, he said to me, the groove is always just before the beat or just after the beat. He goes, he goes, that little slippery space. He He goes, that's where the interest is. That's where the groove is. And that always stuck in my head was it's while it's cool, to be able, and for a lot of forms of especially popular music, quantization, being really locked on is fundamental to their sound. But for something human and organic and that you're trying to connect to emotionally, it's those slippery spaces. It's those places before and after the groove that you really find the heart of the song. And that's what I'm always listening for when I'm producing or making music.
They are beautiful stories that completely typify everything that we've just been discussing. And I mean, Ringo had that slippery space and nailed his snare drum always just behind, and it's so. I'm still trying to replicate it. I still play along to Beatles songs to try and fit in that slippery space. I can't think of a better description of that. It's blooming slippery because it's hard to stay there.
Yeah, it really is. If you're thinking too much about it, you get lost, and when you're I'm sure you're used to, as I'm used to, just grew up with it, working to a click track. You tend to take a click track so literally when you're recording to it, and again, the best people that I've worked with, they hear the click track, and then it disappears in their head, and they've internalized it, and that allows them to move in and out of the groove, and again, that sort of thing connects emotionally. And we're not talking about losing time, but talking about how you address the time in a more, I guess, in a more traditional way. Think about orchestras. Orchestras play with tempo in a way that's foreign to pop music. But in a lot of the classic pop music, there's a movement of a beat or two per minute or that is happening that's sort of imperceptible, but also just makes the songs happen. Actually, I had a guy contact me, and he said, "Hey, did you notice that this boy, that I think this boy's an edit?" And I said, "Well, I mean, it is an edit." And he said, well, and he thought it was an edit in this particular place. And his justification for it was that it went from, let's say, 87 beats per minute to 92 beats per minute. And so I was like, oh, well, okay, let's look at that. So I look at it, and I'm like, all right, you realize that this tempo change happens over 30 seconds. It's meaningless.
Yeah, it's a natural progression. Yeah,
it's a it just happens. Yeah, it just happens. There's no organic musician that is so that their part. Again, in modern terms, we're able to take a performance and quantize it. We can lock it down to a meter if we choose to. But they didn't have that luxury. They couldn't quantize their stuff. So it's just very natural that you're going to get, again, that you might be a little bit slippery. And if you're doing this, you're recording this as part of a band, then the whole idea of working with other musicians is that communication. And we're looking at each other and we're cueing off of each other. And through that communication, we decide together what the timing of this track is, when it's time to move to the next bit of it, when it's time to dive into the chorus or that. And sometimes it's right on the beat, and sometimes it's not quite right on the beat. So, but that's why it feels the way it does, and why it sounds the way it does.
There's beauty in that sound to my ears, and that's why I think that's why one of the sort of contributing factors to why the Beatles' music has lasted so long. It's refreshing for us to hear that, because, like as you say, a lot of modern day music, even for young musicians growing up, they're listening to potentially smaller bands who've recorded at smaller studios, they're still going to be playing to clicks and having their tracks quantized and edited. And it's a shock when you hear recordings from 60s and 70s when you are confronted with music that doesn't feel like that, and it feels different, and you can't quite put your finger on what that difference is. But I think that's one of the main contributing factors as to why it's so well respected and has had the longevity it's had.
Yeah, well, it allows us that. To me, it allows us that human connection. That's the core of it. I feel like my friends are making that music, and not nowadays who knows who's making that music or what's making that music. Which doesn't matter that much.
No,
doesn't matter that when push comes to shove, doesn't matter that much. But if in your music making you have taken the heart out of it in pursuit of perfection, then I don't know why you're making music. I really don't, because music is one of those art forms that at its heart is purely about evoking emotion. So unless you're trying just to club someone over the head with a beat in a dance club environment, that emotional connection is okay. I have to correct myself there too. I get very exclusive sometimes. Even when you're connecting with someone in a dance club and you can get them to just move, that's something too. The early Beatles under Pete Best. If you listen to some tracks that anything that he worked on, that the big beat of the Beatles, that came from the fact that he was an okay drummer, but they were kind of just driving home a 4 on the floor thing like all the time under him, and it was impactful. That was emotionally impactful to drive that kind of really heavy beat home. But I guess more to my point is that the emotion isn't found in perfection. The emotion is found in imperfection. It's found in the moments where that could be me. When I'm listening to it and I think that could be me.
That's a really cool way to think about it. I feel like, I love this. We've gone off on a huge tangent. I'm going to bring us back to Beatles. There's so much I want to speak to you about. If we perhaps while we're on this subject, we can kind of steer very slightly towards what your new book is going to be sort of focusing on. So it covers, right in thinking, sort of Let It Be recording and Abbey Road recording and sort of mixing and release. That's the final piece of the puzzle, isn't it?
That's correct.
So you mentioned the Twickenham rehearsals earlier, and I was going to interject then, and I'm glad I didn't, because it led us to a great place. The Beatles, in a sense, broke the mold of this sort of 3 sessions a day, 3 hours per session. That had long gone by this stage, and they were now able to fulfill their work ethic to its fullest potential, in a sense, and spend a lot of time rehearsing and writing these, 39, 40 times, as you said, these tracks for these albums. I wonder if you could clarify the chronology of these albums, because it's something before I looked into it as a sort of I would certainly not call myself an aficionado, but as somebody who's very interested in Beatles, I'd always been a bit confused about exactly the order of how things were recorded and released and mixed and that kind of stuff. And so perhaps you could just talk about that. So how Let It Be and Abbey Road, the recording and the release and the mixing of of both of those albums.
Well, the germination of Let It Be was that they were looking to do a television show, and the idea of the television show was that they would be filmed preparing for the television show, and then they would do a live concert, and that would be the show. So that's the germination of Let It Be. and why they're being filmed in Twickenham Film Studios and doing the rehearsal work. Well, quickly they went off of the whole band was not signed on to, we're going to do a live performance. They hadn't played live for a number of years in front of an audience, weren't super comfortable with the idea. The they had become so used to these layered recordings where through Pepper, through the White Album, starting with Revolver actually, that they were doing, any one song might contain 19 or 20 different performances. They were so used to that being, the sound that they liked and had developed, and the idea of being forced back into the 4-piece, or with Billy Preston, the 5-piece band. The whole concept of Get Back, and the limitations that imposed on them, they weren't all on board with it. So, they quickly lost interest in the project. Within a month, they had lost interest in the project, essentially, because the Twickenham rehearsals start in early January. By the end of January, they have done the rooftop concert, and then the follow-up the next day, they did the Apple Studio sessions. And, that one's put aside. And what are we going to do with it? Well, now it gets hung up even further in, what are we going to do with this footage? What are we going to do with this audio? What are we going to do with all this? And in the meantime, they don't have an album scheduled. They don't have anything to go. So around April, I think it is then, of '69. So they're done. So keep in mind, they're done in January. They're finished with the Let It Be recordings. They start in early January. They're done at the end of January with them. And it's on to, Glenn Johns to try to throw a mix together. Now they're on to Abbey Road, because now we want to get something out this year that we control, and it's not tied to a television show. It's not tied to anything but what we're doing. So they start in recording Abbey Road.
So this is February of '69 now.
Yeah, and I believe yeah, I'd have to again, look at the dates. I don't have them right in front of me. Don't have that text right in front of me. But essentially, Abbey Road's put to bed. Let It Be's put to bed. And during Let It Be, they are rehearsing and working on songs that end up in Abbey Road, end up as part of it. But again, the idea is we want to get something out there. So they start working on what becomes the Abbey Road project.
Did they start recording the Abbey Road project at Trident Studios?
Yeah, I think the very first track this is what happens when you're editing and doing all this stuff. It's kind of start to lose the thread of it myself. I Want You, She's So Heavy.
Yes,
was started at Trident, and then they moved over to Apple with it. They worked at Olympic, Trident, and EMI Studios during the course of the Abbey Road recordings, whatever was kind of available to them at the time. That's where they started. That's where they started the work, and the album progressed pretty efficiently overall. They had been talking about, again, at the Let It Be sessions, they were already talking about what became the side 2 collage, the long one, so-called long one, or huge melody.
Yes,
was what they called it internally, and they had already been talking about that. There's discussion on the Nagra reels of McCartney and Harrison and Lennon talking about, we've got these bits and what do we do with them? And McCartney talks about, the bits are great. It's how we put them together. It's how we bring them together. That's going to make the difference. So they were, it seems like they were already conceptualizing what would come together as that side 2, mega medley. And then a number of the tracks were recorded in tandem. Ones that we think, we see the album listing and they're individual songs, but they were recorded in pairs in a number of occasions for that. So the intention all along was that those songs would fit together somehow.
That's very cool. I hadn't realized that they were having discussions about that through then, and it did. I mean, it did come together very quickly because it came. Just a pun there. I can't help myself pointing it out. That's terrible. I might edit that out. Just the fact that I've pointed it out. So obviously it was released just September, so 6 months maybe after they started doing it, and that's unthinkable in this day and age. And presumably throughout this whole process, the Let It Be album was still swimming about with Glyn Johns and then eventually Phil Spector, and it was all tied into that TV performance and the TV idea, and it was all just being discussed with management and among themselves.
Yeah, and eventually, of course, it became a movie, right? It became a really dark film. But yeah, that's it's on the back burner certainly. They don't know what to do with it. It's so much material. It was there just wasn't a lot of intentionality about what was going on with Let It Be, and when I talk about '69, I say the Beatles got back twice. They did, they got back to where they once belonged twice. The first one certainly with Let It Be. The idea that they were doing these kind of fairly straightforward rock and rollers, going back to their back catalog, trying to gain that spirit again. That was one form of it. They certainly didn't stay true to it. They, and despite revisionism that says McCartney didn't like the Spector stuff and that happened then in 1970 with the tracks with the orchestrations. To me, that's patently false. Mm-hmm. McCartney would not allow the release of a track that he didn't like. Now, if the critics come back and go, those are some really syrupy strings there, Paul. Then he's like, yeah, well, Spector, I never really wanted him to do the thing, because, no one likes to be criticized. But believe me, those albums did not go out. Let It Be did not go out without the approval of the Beatles. That was the album they wanted you to hear. So, like it or not, that is, the Let It Be, the Spector mixes of Let It Be are what the Beatles wanted us to hear.
Well, they rejected 2 previous Glyn John versions, didn't they?
Yeah, and, exactly.
So they weren't adverse to rejecting albums. They had to have approved it.
There you go. Enough said of that. That's exactly the point. So that was the album they wanted us to hear. But the idea behind it was some of the 2 of Us and One After 909 and some of those tracks. Yeah, they were really it was cool and straightforward and raw and unfinished in a really cool way. So that was one way of getting back. That was one way of reliving the glory days of the Cavern Club in Hamburg and all of that stuff for them. But then they got back again with Abbey Road. They got back to what they did better than anybody else, which was make a very intricate, very connected, very finished recording. It was another thing that they did better than anybody else, and they'd been doing it better than anybody else since Revolver. That was equally home soil for the Beatles. This idea of making something that was just sonically wonderful to listen to, and finished to a degree that other artists dream they could finish a recording. I don't think the Beatles. I think the Beatles knew how good they were on one hand, but I think a lot of it was also just very natural to them in working together. It was just what came out the back end when those guys got in the studio together. Either they pushed each other to those, to those levels and those performances, or it was just the way things worked when those guys got together. And there's been a handful of bands over history that's the way it works with them. You put them. I've heard it said, I think it was a Martin quote, that if you get one of the Beatles in the studio, it's cool. You get two of them, it's great. You get three of them, it's fantastic, and you get four of them, and it's magic.
Yeah.
And there's a handful of bands like that, but the Beatles, through their work ethic, through their internal competitiveness, they just were able to deliver.
It's alchemy, whatever the dynamic between them is musical alchemy for sure.
Yeah.
I've completely lost my train of thought because I was just so engrossed in what you were saying. Oh yes, I remember. So when they moved into doing Abbey Road, obviously EMI Abbey Road studio had then upgraded to the TG12345 desk. From your research, do you think that had much of an impact on the sound of... Obviously, it had an impact on the sound of that album, but of the approach that they took with that album, obviously ignoring some aspects of it which were done at other studios?
I had to say yes and no to that. The bigger impact was the change to everything going on to 8-track. That they knew 8-track was the destination, and that had been the case since the middle point of the White Album. One of the misnomers on the White Album is that that's like their first 8-track album, but over half of that album was done on 4-track, and it was only the back half of the album, and I think less than half of the tracks ended up being finished on 8-track. So I think the biggest difference when you get to Let It Be, or not Let It Be, but to Abbey Road, is more that everything's being done on 8-track now.
They had to have that. They requested Ken Scott to pull it through. EMI had it, didn't they? And they, for some reason, just wasn't in operation.
Yeah, all of the gear that got into Abbey Road had to pass muster with the technical team, with Ken Townsend's team. It had to be able to be durable enough to last through the studio. It had to be set up to be able to handle ADT and vary speed and all these kinds of things. So that was the case in the White Album, is they had the 3M machines there, but they weren't ready to go into service yet. So they pulled it in for While My Guitar Gently Weeps. They kind of hijacked one that was almost ready to go and started working with it. By the end of the White Album sessions, they were, the machines were ready and they were in play. But again, the big difference in terms of their work approach was that they were working on 8-track, so they could work a lot faster. They didn't need to do these tape to tape, 4-track to 4-track tape reductions. They were able to do internal bounce downs where I've almost filled up the 8-track, and now I can do a little sub mix of a few elements of it and open up some real estate to do more work. So it's just a lot more efficient working process when you're not having to move between a couple of machines. They still did tape to tape on 8-track, but just wasn't as required. Overall, their working process didn't change very much.
Okay.
They were still doing group backing tracks. They were still doing group overdubs. So fundamentally, they were just making an album like they always made albums when it came to Abbey Road. The big difference in the fidelity of the album was the fact that now the TG12345 board was solid state. It allowed them to do equalization and dynamics control, compression and limiting on every channel, on every input channel.
So
that's a huge change.
At this point, this sort of links to one of the questions I wanted to ask you. So in the the book I happen to have next to me is the Pepper Zero book, and it talks about it's not specific, but it says plug-in EQ box, which they were using as sort of an outboard
plug-in EQ to the red desk. Now, do you know what that EQ was?
Yeah, well, they had a number of plug-in EQ boxes. Typically, what those boxes were, like the Presence box, the RS-127. What those boxes did was they compensated for what was not built into the board. So the RS-127, I think, has 4 distinct EQ bands that it hits, and I used to have them memorized. But at any rate, it has four EQ points, like 3.5 kilohertz, 5 kilohertz, 8 kilohertz, 10 kilohertz. Why it had those was that the red consoles, the red 51 and the red 37 consoles lacked those EQ points. So that piece of gear then made by plugging in that EQ, now I have control over those pieces of the spectrum. So that's how those were used. And it was the same thing when they started using the RS-56 equalization unit, the curve bender, which was initially employed in the mastering process because it gave control over a lot of control over 4 distinct EQ bands. Typically that was used in mastering, but the Beatles were able to employ it on their recording. And again, all the reason for this was that they would use it was to gain more control and allow them then to differentiate their instruments and their performances more finely. And that was necessary because the red consoles themselves only had what you could think of as bass and treble control.
Yeah.
They had bass, treble, and presence control. The presence frequencies are somewhere between 4K and 8K, and so you could dial up what they call the presence on a signal, and then you basically had bass and treble control. So think of that with the home stereo. If you had bass, mid-range, treble, and that's all you could dial in to differentiate sound. Well, by accessing these external pieces of gear, the RS-127 presence box and the RS-56 curve bender, it allowed them for more fine control over the EQ curves of any signal that they were recording.
So these would have had a sound that the Beatles were used to hearing, and for those of you listening who aren't into recording, valves have a very specific sound, and suddenly moving to transistors is I know that they will have worked in other studios, but it will have marked a huge change sonically for them. They would have been sat in front of the speakers and the desk and heard a different quality of sound. Not saying it would have been better or worse. There's debate about that, but it certainly would have been different, and sort of by my reckoning, it certainly would have influenced some of the decisions they'd made, whether they were conscious of it or not, perhaps.
Oh no, it certainly did. It certainly influences the decisions you make. You're hearing different things in the music, as you mentioned with valve-based consoles. There is due to the technology, there is this kind of natural harmonic distortion that gets added to things. There's a natural compression that gets added to signals. But additionally, with the red consoles and the setup at EMI, and in fact studios of that era, they had such little outboard gear. Like any typical Beatles session would only have maybe one or two mono compressors and one or two mono limiters. That would be and then the external EQs that we've just mentioned, the RS-56 and the RS-127. So that's a really limited toolkit to do your work. And now when I'm recording, because I'm recording to 4-track and I'm recording a group of performances, with the early Beatles recordings, there could be an entire band's backing track, guitars, drums, bass, all on one track of audio. So what happens in those cases then with this outboard that helps you control and shape the sound is you're averaging out, you're making your choice around just the fact that I only get one compressor for all of this now on its way to tape. So I have to kind of figure out my volume balance, my tonal balance, as well as how aggressive I want to attack it with compression, all through one device. And now when I move into the era of the TG 1 2 3 4 5 console, now every single channel I've got, I can sculpt the EQ. I can sculpt the signal that's going through it. Ringo didn't only have one channel of drums anymore. He had 7 input channels of drums that could be very tailored. They only ended up with typically one channel on the tape. But on the way in, before I sum it down to that one channel, I've got control over 7 microphones that I can tailor any way I want. I can make that kick drum really boomy. I can make the tom-toms deep. I can make the overheads really crispy. You couldn't do that before. I had this a summing box that was the RS-144, a 4-channel input that I could get additional inputs into it. And I could do a volume balancing between microphones, but that was it. Then I was back to one EQ and one compressor. And all that makes a huge difference.
It's a huge change. It's a massive step up. It's it's not progressed a huge amount more than that up until the modern age. That's what channel strips have now, and that will have been. Obviously, they'll have a lot more complicated stuff on them. Presumably there weren't buses and all that kind of stuff on this desk, but it will have been a huge step up. It might have looked, must have been like just represented the modern. There was space travel in '67 and all this kind of stuff. They must have thought they were looking at the future of recording.
Well, they really were. It was a truly modern console, and in the spirit of handmade consoles that were being put together for Trident, the A-range consoles for Trident, and the Helios consoles that were going into Olympic. Very much in that spirit. It was a truly modern console. Now, the Red boards did have, of course, input channel. They had master channels. They had echo sends and that kind of thing. So they were close. They had some modern facility. It just very limited. Just very limited. And now with the TG consoles, again, you've got the first inkling of a completely contained, self-contained modern recording console that they're able to work through.
So there we go. Always feel really mean cutting the conversation out halfway. But I hope you enjoyed that, and I hope you look forward to the next one, because it's just as interesting as that conversation. I do urge you to go to Amazon or Jerry's website. It just links to Amazon anyway, so it's a medium that Jerry is happy with you buying through. So go to Amazon and type in the Beatles Recording Reference Manuals, and you'll see Volume 5. They are just incredible books. So I've got mine on the way, and I definitely urge you to do the same. And support people like Jerry, who are putting an amazing amount of effort into archiving a lot of this material. It's amazing. So I'll link to all this stuff in the notes for the podcast as well. So whatever app or however you're listening to this, if you're feeling a bit lazy, you can just scroll down and click some links below, and it will take you to all the places I've just told you. So that just leaves me to remind you that you can get in contact with me. It's joe@allyouneedisdrums.com. Or you could do it also through my website, allyouneedisdrums.com. On my website, there are lots and lots of free Beatles stems. I think I've done 21 tracks so far this year. I'm doing one every week. So you can go to my website and download the sort of recorded version of those drums, so you can play around with that. There's also transcriptions that you can buy of those drum parts, and I'm adding to them all the time because I'm gradually working through the whole of the Beatles studio catalogue and beyond. So yeah, do that, and feel free to get in touch with me with any feedback or guest suggestions or anything you like. I'd also like to say a great big thank you to my good friend Joe Kane for the intro and outro music he put together for this for me. And another good friend of mine, David Henshaw, for the incredible artwork that he supplies me with every 2 weeks. So I will see you in a fortnight for the second episode of the conversation with Jerry Hammack. And I hope you all have a special fortnight. All right, goodbye.